All right, what's up, guys? In this video, I just kind of want to address this. There's this confusion. That's the difference between compressors and limiters, and different types of compressors and different types of limiters. Probably where it makes the most sense to start is that there are certain problems that we have to deal with, and the confusion is coming from that different people will recommend different solutions for the same problems. To understand this, why is this happening? It's very important to start at the digital versus analog discussion, because, for example, analog hardware compressors will behave, especially in their attack time, they will behave entirely different than their plugin. Even the closest plugin emulation, there's just no way to like 100% match those attack and those release times. The real world units will always operate differently, and this is not a good or a bad thing. Like this actually doesn't matter once you realize that you have different types of plugins to solve the problems that you would solve differently with a hardware unit, for example. Probably the biggest confusion that I see all the time is that people are talking about limiters as if they were still compressors. And this is true if you're working with hardware units, because in the case of hardware units, and let me just load up this LA2A emulation, for example. There's this switch between a limiting mode and a compressing mode. All this does is basically it's altering your ratio. I think in the case of this unit, it's like 10:1 and 4:1 when you're using it on compress compared to limiter. I'm not entirely sure, maybe it's 20:1 or like maybe even more. I really don't know the exact parameters of this unit, but this is an analog modeled plugin. So this is modeled from a real hardware unit. But when you are dealing with a different type of limiter, such as the L2, or I could say like any other brickwall limiter that I have here, for example, the maximizer is what I use the most. These are operating with an entirely different mindset. Like this is not just like very high ratio and very fast attack. No, these units do not have a compressor attack time. These are absolutely zero, and they catch every single peak. This is where the confusion is coming from, that people are still referring to limiters as if they were this type of limiter instead of like this type of limiter. If you use the full names of these units and the full like descriptive terms for them, this is a brickwall limiter, and this is a limiting amplifier, or like a leveling amplifier, as they used to call these. It's like if you say this whole description, it all of a sudden will hopefully make sense. But people in the analog domain will refer to limiters as this most often, and people in the digital domain will refer to limiters as these most often. And this is where this confusion is coming from. And it's also like important to realize that, for example, I'm just gonna load up a random compressor. It doesn't even matter which unit, but this threshold on this compressor and this threshold on a maximizer or a brickwall limiter is not the same threshold. They are operating with they mean this is the same word, but it means a completely different thing. And this is also gives some opportunity for confusion. So also it's let me just pull up the 1176 for a second, because it's best to explain on this one. Because if you have a hardware unit and the knob is working on this unit in the other way, which is kind of weird, but it's just what it is. So if you set it to super fast, this is the fastest attack you can get. On the plugin, you're never going to match what a hardware unit would do with this type of speed. It just doesn't even matter how good the plugin emulation is. The UAD ones, especially the paid ones, not this legacy, but the paid ones are pretty close to what the hardware unit does in terms of like overall sound, and even if you go like more extreme. But this attack time is just, I think there has to be some sort of a processing limitation here, or like I don't know. I mean by the CPU. So like that is done with a computer and not with like real world physics. But this attack time is just, I haven't heard any plugin that could match this. So you can solve certain problems and certain peaks in the real world by getting like an 1176 type of real hardware unit to like work with these fast attack times. But in the digital world, there's just no solution with the compressors, because the compressor is always going to have an attack time, and it's always going to be noticeable in the cases, especially if you're using native plugins. Like UAD has some, like for example, if you use this channel strip compressor, but like this is a different sounding compressor than the 1176 what I've just showed. But this one you can turn on these fast attack settings and set the ratio to like infinite, and it's going to sound like kind of close, but it's still going to leave the peaks. Like I mean, I can even show this on a drum loop. Before I would, this is how it sounds without any processing. And so I'm just gonna turn on this compressor with like just very aggressive settings, just to. So let me print it so that you can see that there's these peaks, and this is the problem. Like, this is what cannot be matched with plugins. However fast they are and however good they are, they will always leave these peaks. And this is the problem with using plugin compressors for peak shaving type of jobs. Instead of this one, you should be, in most cases, if this is like a really huge problem to shave off peaks, then you're much better off with a brickwall limiter in the case of individual plugins. Now, obviously, you cannot go bananas with these, because the reason why people who are very used to, especially people who are very used to hardware units, the reason why they won't ever recommend brickwall limiter plugins for these types of jobs is because the sound is entirely different, and the sound is noticeably more processed and noticeably more digital, especially if you go like extreme settings. But I would say, like, with the right settings, if you keep stuff, for example, on this unit, it's the transparent setting I use the most, and on this unit, it's the, what's that called? The transient, with this emphasis turned on, is what I use the most. The thing is, with the right settings, you can get away with a decent amount of transient preservation while still reducing the dynamic range in a way where you cannot really hear that it's processed. On the drum loop, this is not the best example to see and to explain, but this is why I prepared these vocal examples. So just so to illustrate this one and what's happening, just check the peak meter. I don't care what they say, they don't know about you. So between this peak and between the leveled out stuff, there's like roughly 10 dB difference. If you don't care about loudness, and if you don't care about... so at the end of your channel, or at the end of your output channel, the way it goes, you have to have a limiter in there, because otherwise there's just you're going to clip. Like the way how loud masters are and mixes are nowadays, like you cannot get away without a limiter. And these limiters, as good as they are and as optimized as they are and as much look ahead time as they have, they will still get overwhelmed if they have to deal with these peaks. In the context of judging this as a one-off thing, like, you know, this is just one vocal stem. This is not the end of the world, and any on an individual level basis, the limiter can deal with this very easily. But once you have the kick drums, once you have the basses, once you have the other synths, once you have the everything else and the vocal, and you have to like and these peaks are happening, those might create this sudden little micro distortions that you don't have to deal with those, as long as you do a very simple adjustment, which is to set up a brickwall limiter and only shave off these peaks where these are happening. Like, for example, I think I'm already doing a good job here. Like, can be a little bit more aggressive. I don't care what they say, they don't know about you. And it's also like it's kind of important. I will go into this one in a second too, that both compressors and both limiters will colorize your audio, but they are colorizing in different ways. And the reason why people tend not to recommend using limiters in some cases is because limiters tend to colorize more noticeably and more digitally, if this makes sense, like more plasticky than compressors would do. But at the same time, as long as you're only touching these peaks, you're only like colorizing that peak, and otherwise, if these limiters are now designed in like such a way that if they don't directly interfere with the audio in these parts, for example, only at this peak, then they won't colorize it. So it's not going to be a problem. They are only dealing with the problem, which is this peak. I don't care what they say, they don't know about you. So yeah, this is one example where in individual cases, this is where I would recommend using a brickwall limiter and set this threshold or gain accordingly, obviously, and then set your output level accordingly. On this unit, if I'm holding down the option key right now, you can see that the output is moving together with the gain as I'm adjusting it, so that I get a get a real-time adjustment, because on most brickwall limiters, and especially the ones with a threshold, as you're lowering the threshold, you're also upping the output level. So if I lower this 4 dB, that means that I added 4 dB gain. So you would need to like to get the even level, you would need to compensate this with reducing the output with 4. So yeah, this is just something to keep in mind. And another case where brickwall limiters are, where the most crucial point, as I've already said, it's going to be your like output channel. You cannot get away without a brickwall limiter nowadays with the loudness units we have to work with nowadays. But brickwall limiters are frequently overlooked as something to sum your buses, like at the very end of your bus. Again, just for these peak shaves, like, you know, not with drastic settings and not to touch the audio where it's not necessary. But there's going to be places where the brickwall limiter will do a better job just because they don't have an attack time, you know, compared to a compressor, which plug-in compressors and also real life hardware units also always have an attack time if they are a compressor, but hardware units can sound more attackless, if this makes sense, than the plugin counterparts. And so now let's get to, like, this is where I would use, so just to summarize what I've just said right now, the 3 cases where I personally would use a brickwall limiter is, one, if I need to like deal just these one-off or like sudden peaks, you know, which I don't want to like, and let me just show it in it, for example. It was here, right? I don't know. I don't care what they say. Can go a little bit more, right? I don't care what they say. They don't know about you. A bit less. So just so the waveform wise, it makes sense. You can see that it got rid of this, and there's like, I mean, technically I can show what's the difference between these, right? This is all I get rid of, and I think this is a positive, and I like to do this. So the 3 main cases where I would use a brickwall limiter is these types of jobs where you just need to shave off these one-off sudden peaks, and on your master output channel, and on certain bus channels at the very end of them. Now, when should you use a compressor, right? And basically everywhere else where you would need like dynamic range reduction. And it's also important to realize that compressors are more, like, I personally tend to think them about more as a sound design tool, as an actual dynamics processor, because it's just so easy to create these volume rides. It's not, again, we're not working with analog equipment anymore, where it's like kind of a more slow and a more painful experience to dial in like automations and whatnot. In those cases, it's just much more convenient to use a compressor. But like in the digital world, I tend to think about compressors more as a sound design unit. But one use case where they are very, very useful is that if you have, like, for example, like you can see on the waveform, like, it's just, this is so much quieter than this part, and obviously you always have the option to just change the gain like this. But if you don't have sudden peaks where you need, which you would want to take care of it with the L2, or if you use that first and then you use a compressor later on, that's also like a good strategy to like stack these to address the individual problems that you have, is that you can kind of even out the dynamic range with a compressor then. But this is best viewed as like, you would use a limiter, a brickwall limiter, not an analog emulation limiter, but a brickwall limiter where you have to deal with like one-off and sudden stuff. And you should use a compressor when you are dealing with long-term like stuff. This is how I could explain this the best. So I know it's been a minute since you walked right through that door, but I still think about you all the time. I'm lonely, I'm lonely, I'm lonely as fuck. Come hold me, come hold me, come hold me. It's been me. So, for example, if I now bounce this one in place, you can see that the waveforms are matched much closer to each other. And you can already see that this compressor, because it has an attack time, and this is the point, that it created this peak. So again, if I do this type of processing, I would like put an L2 here and only try to address this peak until, or like maybe these other peaks that are here, which are like not that huge of an issue at the start of like every phrase, just to shave those off. But otherwise, for leveling out these long phrases, I would use a compressor instead of a limiter, because that's To be fair, that's also a solution, right? To use a brickwall limiter as your leveling tool, but it's always going to sound a little bit more processed than if and less real, like than if you would use even a plugin compressor, like not just in the case like there are different types of compressors, obviously, for different types of jobs, and probably this is the one that I would most likely use for whether I'm setting it to limit or compress, whether I would use on most vocals where I seriously need to like tame the dynamic range. But sometimes I also use this Pro C2. I like this a lot, and probably I'm trying to demonstrate most stuff with the C2 and the L2 because I assume that these are the plugins that most people are using. While we're at this thought, the only two use cases where I would use an analog limiter emulation, which is really and truly just a compressor with a higher ratio. And it's important to realize that these are not catching every single peak. Like these are not working the same way as a brick wall would at 0. Some peaks will get through these types of limiters. This is just a high ratio compressor. It's important to get this. It's just important to realize this. And so the only two use cases that I have with this unit are, as I've just explained, in some cases, the vocal. If I'm not using a compressor, then I'm going to use like this unit, either with a compressor or the limiting setting, but I'm talking about right now with the limiting setting. And another use case where I would sometimes use this, it's pretty rare, but on like non-transient buses, like where I just want to like take care a little bit of the dynamics, but I don't want to brick wall it because there's no point in that. But I also don't want to like compress it because I want a little bit more than that. That's for example like pads. Like if you group pads together and you kind of want to like glue them together or like juice them together, instead of using a compressor, sometimes I might use this exact unit, for example, in the case of a plugin. One thing that I also want to kind of touch on is this coloring, because you can test this very easily yourself, like what plugin, what type of coloring does it do, and the way you do this is like you just look for a sine wave. Perfect. I'm just gonna bounce this one into audio, and these are not necessary to be here anymore. And just set up an analyzer at the end of your master. We don't even like, this is how it sounds like, but we don't really need to listen to this one right now. We only need to like see what it does, and you can listen to the certain type of colorations yourself once you do the same thing. So I just exported a sine wave. There's nothing special about this. I generated it with Serum, and what's important is to look at the analyzer, how it looks like. Like this is how it looks like. And if I add the compressor to it, it creates these overtones to it. And every single compressor and every single limiter will have different types of overtone generations. And like as you can see, as long as it's not touching the signal, it's not coloring it. So coloring only becomes an issue once it's truly touching the signal. And as you can see, this is a very different type of profile than what you saw with this compressor, for example. And even if I set it to extreme, it's much more subtle. And especially like there are different settings. For example, if you set it to mastering, you won't even have to deal with any sort of coloring at all in the case of this compressor. But yeah, different types of units will add different types of colorizations to your audio. It's just something that I kind of wanted to touch on. And if this is important for you, then you can always just check what does it do with a simple sine wave, and you can kind of all of a sudden realize that if you not just have this bump here, but you have like a full-on waveform, if you apply this compressor or this sort of limiter, like then it colors every single it colors the whole frequency range. So it's just this is what people are referring to when they are talking about colorization and certain types of issues. And in most cases, for me, this is not really a huge problem, but again, it's just something that needs to be addressed, I believe. Maybe just another thing to like clarify what this true peak is, because this is also sometimes I see that it's confusing to people what this is. And what true peak means is that if you have this turned off, your limiter is going to work in a way where it only takes care, and it only listens to what's happening with ones and zeros in the digital realm. So it's going to catch your peaks. Like, for example, if you it stops at 0, so that there's no problem there. But once this gets converted, because the human ear don't hear ones and zeros, we need analog signals. So it needs to be reconverted for us, to actually hear the waveform. And once this conversion happens from ones and zeros into an analog waveform, which you can hear, sometimes these peaks could happen and distortions could happen. And this is what this true peak means. Once the conversion takes place, there won't be peaks in the analog waveform. So you're not just taking care of the digital, but you're also taking care of the analog. So on your master bus, I recommend enabling this setting, but anywhere else, it doesn't matter as much, to be honest. So yeah, this is basically all that I wanted to address in this video, and hopefully this makes sense. And just to summarize this video, brickwall limiters, you kind of want to use on one-off peaks and sudden peaks, and at the end of your master chain, and sometimes at the end of certain like buses that you have set up, where again you just want to like peak control with a brickwall limiter. And when to use a compressor. Compressors are best used for evening out long sections and as a sound design tool mainly, because you can always do volume rides or volume automations. That's always an option. But if you want a more gluey or certain sounding, so if this dynamic range reduction, you want it to sound in a certain way, then compressors can be a more elegant solution for that type of job. And when to use an analog emulation limiter, which is limiting or leveling amplifier, which is not the same as a brickwall limiter. This is a brickwall limiter, and again, just to demonstrate this is what a non-brickwall limiter looks like. And just to show this one, this is going to go into red as I'm driving up the gain. You can see this is not a brickwall limiter. A brickwall limiter would catch it at 0, like so. So yeah, hopefully the difference makes sense, that analog emulation limiters are not brickwall limiters, but compressors with a high ratio. But then brickwall limiters are not just compressors with a high ratio or like something like that. This is an entirely different unit and works in an entirely different way. Yeah, basically, I think this is it. Yeah, thanks for watching this video, and see you the next time.